Good evening. How's everybody tonight? Are you as excited about this event as I am? It's with such great pleasure that I welcome Vandana Shiva to the University of California at Santa Cruz. I think I speak for all of us tonight to say what a great honor it is to be able to host you on our campus. So I'll start with a little bit of a personal anecdote, if you don't mind. Your early work was so formative for me when I was a graduate student because I was in geography, and you opened up new conversations about globalization by initially critiquing the myth of the flat world, the form of leveling and erasure of difference that were put forward by neoliberal pundits such as Thomas Friedman, remember him, in his wildly popular books at the time, The Lexus and the Olive Tree and The World is Flat. Indeed, your talk made me look for one of your pithy critiques of the latter work this afternoon, and I have it here. Friedman, you wrote, has reduced the world to the friends he visits, the CEOs he knows, and the golf courses he plays at. From this microcosm of privilege, exclusion, and blindness, he shuts out both the beauty of diversity and the brutality of exploitation and inequality. He shuts out the social and ecological externalities of economic globalization and free trade. He shuts out the walls that globalization is building, walls of insecurity, hatred, and fear, walls of intellectual property, walls of privatization. Alas, if anything, these walls have only increased since you wrote this several years ago. So you're so welcome to come here again and tell it like it is one more time. You were one of the very first people who was taking on some of these widely shared axioms of prosperity, and rather than joining unthinkingly in the praise, you pointed to some of the problems, the underbelly of a form of corporate free market winner-take-all globalization that needed addressing. You have done this type of intensive examination and critique in so many different areas and made a difference in how people think and talk about issues of great contemporary relevance, and not just in universities, but in popular consciousness and public debates as well. So my colleague, Tim Galarneau, is going to do a more proper introduction following my remarks, but I just wanted to say thank you for myself, for all of us, for your hard work. And it so happens that I have a little thank you gift to accompany my verbal thank you. It's a wood block print of a seed. And the history of this print is that Tim, my colleague at CASFIS, the Center of Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, he commissioned UCSC alumnus Damian Bartholomew to make the image as the logo for the new UCSC Demeter Seed Library. And Damien, along with Tim and the Seed Library, were all deeply inspired by your writings and activism. We hope the print will join Vandana's own Seed Library at Bija Vidyapith Earth University in India and connect our two campuses. So your work has deeply influenced a generation of UC Santa Cruz scholars and advocates for agroecology, ecofeminism, and inclusive alternatives to corporate globalization. On behalf of the entire campus, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Glad to be here, and that brings back many memories. I'm Tim Galarneau, and that seed vision was a vision drawn in of future generations, and we'll have that available, I think, through many online mediums with our Food and Garden Guide to Right Livelihood College that we'll speak to in this introduction. But what I'd like to begin with is a deep honor just to be here with all of you tonight and to be with an amazing scholar and activist and thinker that has inspired me for decades. And I've had the opportunity to work with Vandana and Nancy Chen, two extraordinary individuals, over the last decade and a half that have spanned projects in the region, the state, the country, and beyond. So for those of you unfamiliar with Dr. Vandana Shiva's work, as a world-renowned scholar and leader for economic, food, and gender justice, Dr. Shiva was trained as a physicist and later shifted her focus to interdisciplinary research in science, technology, and environmental policy, with over 20 books and numerous publications spanning nearly 4 decades. In 1982, she founded an independent institute, the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology, which was dedicated to high-quality and independent research to address the most significant ecological and social issues of our times in close partnership with local communities and social movements. In 1991, she founded Navdanya, a national movement to protect the diversity and integrity of living resources, especially native seed, and to promote organic farming and fair trade. In 2004, in collaboration with Schumacher College in the UK, she started Bij Vidyapith, Earth University, an international college for sustainable living in Dehradun in northern India. Time magazine's identified Dr. Shiva as an environmental hero, and Forbes magazine has identified her as one of the top 7 most powerful women in the globe in 2010. Yes. Among her many awards are the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Right Livelihood Award, the Order of Golden Ark, the UN's Global 500 Roll of Honor, and the Midori Prize for Biodiversity in 2016. Now, the Right Livelihood College, anchored at UC Santa Cruz in partnership with the Right Livelihood Award, is an amazing deep collaboration emerging and growing with projects and partnerships, and I encourage you to look at your program to find out more information on them too. I met Vandana as an undergraduate at a UC-wide leadership summit on sustainability hosted by the California Student Sustainability Coalition in Santa Barbara in spring 2004. She offered some generative insights and planted a seed of support for a UC Foods campaign I was leading to establish a sustainable food purchasing policy for the University of California. I wanted to do something around shifting the practices of placing tens of millions of pounds of chemical pesticides into California's soil, impacting workers and communities, as well as our larger ecological network of species therein. That policy to shift 20% of UC food buying towards real food was approved in 2008 by President Mark Yudof, and to date it has shifted over $250 million in buying food toward local, organic, ecological, humane, and just food across our 10 campuses and our 5 medical centers. And that was the type of generative movement connections Vandana brings where she goes, across the generations to young people really looking for a model for change. And no doubt tonight she will plant many more seeds to inspire and offer perspectives and conversation on the intersections of capital, technology, agriculture, and the future stewardship of our planet. And to change scenes now with Dr. Nancy Chen, an amazing UCSC home faculty member and leader, she's trained as a medical anthropologist, focusing on healing practices in health institutions. Her early ethnographic project compared how psychiatry and mental health became national agendas for the social integration in Asia, while simultaneously alternative forms of healing resurged. She's conducted fieldwork in mainland China, primarily with comparative research in the United States. Her interests include the study of healing narratives, chronic and infectious diseases, traditional medical knowledge, and intersections between the body politic, gender, ethnicity, and medicine. Chen's recent research examines the role of biotechnology in the pharmaceutical industries in Asian societies. She regularly teaches on the anthropology of food and focuses on changing meanings of food in medicine. In 2014, I began working with Nancy on examining the issue of student hunger and homelessness in higher education. Dr. Chen was prepared to speak on campus leadership and work on building an integrated group of stakeholders in developing new interventions and assessments of food and housing insecurity at UCSC. Her compassionate and clear approach to advising groundbreaking graduate student research on these topics, as well as being the inaugural director of the UCSC Blum Center, has led to numerous budding efforts to bring dignity, respect, and access for student basic needs in California higher education. Both of these women bring their strength, wisdom, and insight as teachers, researchers, and leaders. And I'd like to express my gratitude to both of them and invite you all to welcome Dr. Chen and Dr. Shiva to the stage for our evening program.
Thank you. So we're starting at 7:25.
Yes.
How long should we?
Till 8 o'clock. So, welcome everyone, and it's a real delight. Thank you, Tim, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Dean Mitchell, also for welcoming everyone as well. I just have a couple of quick informational announcements before we begin. I wanted to let you know that if you need to use the restroom, it's out in the lobby to the side over here. And actually, I'll be looking at my phone from time to time just to keep watch on the time. If you have a phone, please silence it so that we can keep focus on Dr. Shiva's remarks. And there will be index cards being circulated throughout the conversation. If you have any questions that you would like to ask Dr. Shiva, at about 7:55, I will probably ask folks to please hand them over to the side, and we will collect them. At 8 o'clock, we'll actually invite Dr. Shiva to actually respond to some of the questions from the floor. So those are just some of the informational announcements. And before I begin, I also want to thank our sponsors and contributors, and of course, the Right Livelihood College and our Right Livelihood College Director Coordinator, David Shaw, the Institute for Social Transformation, the Division of Social Sciences, the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, the Food Systems Working Group, UCSC Alfred Heller Chair Professor Stacy Philpott, and to the UCSC Arboretum for these beautiful flowers here. So, yeah. So anyway, Dr. Shiva, it's a wonderful joy to welcome you here to UC Santa Cruz. And
My joy to be with you, yeah.
And I'd like to kind of begin by asking about, in your own words, what is right livelihood and why does it matter? As a recipient of the Right Livelihood Award, what is it meant to be a part of this family and to be a laureate?
Well, right livelihood basically means living according to the right laws of the universe, of human justice, ecological sustainability. In our cultures of the East, the word dharma is right livelihood. And because each of us is embedded in relationships, those relationships shape your duties, your obligations, and in India we call it swadharma, the right way to act according to your relationships with the earth, with the different biodiversity, with your family, with your fellow students, with your teachers, all of that web of relationships. And the Right Livelihood Award has gone out of its way to look for people who are contributing to right livelihood, who are taking courageous stands. The awardees this year include the indigenous people of the Amazon who are fighting their displacement. And it's an amazing community, so when we have our reunions once in a decade or 2 decades, I have personal deep respect for the group of awardees, and I also want to recognize the amazing founder of Right Livelihood Awards, Jakob von Uxel, who actually put his amazing stamp collection as the endowment for the award. And the Right Livelihood Colleges, of one of which is on your campus, are new ways to continue learning for right livelihood.
Great, thank you so much. So you've published over 20 books and many, many more articles over the past 3 decades. And you've really created resources for community members, for activists and scholars. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your first book, Staying Alive. The subtitle is Women, Ecology, and Survival in India, which drew attention to the struggles of third world women and their work, not only to survive, but also for the collective. Can you talk a little bit more about how the work of ecofeminism continues on worldwide today?
On the book itself, Yesterday they were screening a film that is being made on me by Jim Beckett. And interestingly, he had interviews with my publisher. It was a publishing house called Kali for Women, and now called Women Unlimited. And I was giving a talk at the Women's Conference in Nairobi, 1985. And it was the first time in the UN conferences a connection was being made between issues of protection of the environment and women's rights. And Ritu said, you have to write this. And I said, no, I chucked up an academic career. I'm never ever going to write. I'm never going to publish. I'm out of the rat race. And she said, but writing can be a subversive activity. And encouraged me to write Staying Alive. While so much of what's in the book is from the movements I was part of, from the women. But I had to go into the background. Why is forestry the way it is? Why is agriculture the way it is? And then I had to go into the roots of the thinking of Bacon and Boyle and Newton. Amazing patriarchy. Amazing ideas that nature is inert and has to be conquered. And the idea that we are part of nature is an effeminate idea. And Bacon talked about the birth of masculine time as a separation. So what has happened in these many years? How has ecofeminism grown? The first thing is more and more young men are realizing they can be ecofeminists, which is recognizing the rights of the earth and women as equal. Doesn't take too much, does it? But even more importantly, recognizing that this construction of patriarchy has subjugated women, and capitalist patriarchy has dominated over nature, but it has also limited the humanity of men by a particular construct of masculinity as violent. And I think men are seeking a liberation from violence too.
Great, thank you. So, in 1999, you sue Monsanto for conducting illegal BT cotton trials and crop trials in India, which resulted in great danger, death threats, hate speech, smear campaigns, and social media even then did not, that we're not even talking about social media,
No.
This is mainstream media. However, there's been a lot of recent big wins right now against Monsanto, and particularly against the herbicide glyphosate. Which is the main chemical in Roundup, a very common pesticide. Can you talk about what's happened since that period, and why this is significant?
Before I come to the issue of cancer and the glyphosate trials here in America, of which there are now 85,000. And just the first 4 led to, I think, basically liability of about $4 billion. But in the process, Bayer, who has bought Monsanto, their value dropped $63 billion, which is equivalent to what they paid to buy Monsanto. Yeah. Yes, 1999, I had to bring a case against Monsanto. And interestingly, there's no way we could have found out what they were doing. But the arrogance is so big, they'd put full-page ads. Next year, Indian farmers will have the BT cotton seeds. So I rang up our Ministry of Environment. I said, did you approve it? Because we had written the laws of biosafety. And they said, no, nobody contacted us, and we don't know what BT cotton is. I asked the Agriculture Ministry. They said, we have no idea. So I sued Monsanto for doing illegal work, but I sued the government for sleeping. Yeah. And that case led to stopping Monsanto's commercial approval till 2002. More importantly, it actually woke up the sleeping structures of regulation. And after BT cotton, not a single crop has been approved in India, a GMO crop. Illegal, sneaking in, yes, but not legal approval. But it's in that period, watching Monsanto so closely, and they're seeking patents on life and patents on seed. I worked with our parliament, I worked with our government, and we managed to write in our patent laws an Article 3J, which says plants, animals, and humans are not, and seeds are not human inventions. Yeah? And therefore they can't be patented. Now, I've had to deal with at least 5 other cases with Monsanto because they constantly challenge this law. And I have to intervene. And so far, they have not managed to strike down this clause. So they actually have no patents on seed in India. And I hope the movements in the United States will build strong enough to say this was never allowed by Congress, it's never been discussed in our communities, and patenting seed and patenting life is an absolute outrage that should stop. And on the cancer trials, so much of the way Monsanto functions is by going after scientists and going after research agencies. So they tried to destroy the career of Eric Seralini, who did the first research. But he was looking for what does it do to vital organs. He was a toxicologist. And he found there were mammalian tumors. Then the WHO, International Agency on Research and Cancer, came out with the carcinogenic probability. That's what led to the cases here. And there was an attempt to use the US government to withdraw support to the World Health Organization because of this one decision. And I've stood at White House and protested GMOs and issue of GMO labeling. And I always say, I said, it doesn't matter who the president is. Why do they always end up being advertising and marketing agents of Monsanto? Surely we need some separation between big business and democratic government.
So this is a follow-up question from my undergraduate students. I'm currently teaching an anthropology course called Culture Through Food. And so many of the students want to ask you, what is the most challenging part of standing up to entities such as Monsanto that have much more resources as well as protection over GMOs?
The Monsantos of the world and the Bayers of the world have huge resources. They also have huge capacity to distort. And their public relations and advertising wings are bigger than their research wings, which is why they can keep track of a small person like me, and where do I go and where do I speak. I mean, that takes money to pay those lobbyists to do this. How do you take them on? First, by believing in your truth, your knowledge. Whenever I take on a campaign, the first thing I do is deep research. Because I know I'm up against these big giants. So I did all the research that was possible on intellectual property rights. And there will be a new book out in the US on my work on seeds, biodiversity, and intellectual property rights, including the WTO and intellectual property rights agreement, etc., and all the cases we have fought and won on piracy, where corporations like Monsanto just go grab knowledge. And countries like India have so much knowledge of biodiversity, our Ayurvedic systems. Everything's available for grab. And I think if you take on the pirates with truth and evidence, the pirates run. So there's nothing stronger than truth. There's nothing bigger than your conscience. And if you stay guided by your conscience and don't give up your search for truth, your speaking the truth, all the attempts for them to silence you don't always work because truth can't be silenced.
Thank you. So in 2014, the United Nations declared 2014 to be the first International Year of Soil. And in that year, you also published your book, Soil, Not Oil. This was also at the same time that you launched a joint statement with fellow Right Livelihood Award laureate Nimo Bassi in Nigeria. So can you say a little bit more about how this work has really contributed to more awareness of biodiversity, which you've mentioned a little bit, as well as its literal embodiment in soil?
So a little bit on Nemo. You know, I was part of IFG, the International Forum on Globalization, and we organized the teach-in at Seattle and the mobilization, which shut WTO down in 1999. There were celebrations. And I remember, you know, we used to do these teach-ins, and one was in the Riverside Church at New York. And while we were having the teach-in, we got this message. This amazing activist, Ken Saro-Wiwa, had been hung in Nigeria for fighting Shell, the oil company. So we did a memorial right there. And 20 years later, I was invited by Nemo to his Right Livelihood College in Nigeria for the memorial 20 years later of Ken Saro-Wiwa. So of course I went. Actually, I started working on the issue of soil, not oil in the lead up to the Copenhagen Summit on climate. Because I realized that, in a way, the climate debate had gone shrunk, yeah? One, it had moved into the stratosphere, away from the land and the soil, and everyone was keeping track of how many parts per million up there, but no one was keeping track of what's happening on the land, what's happening in the ground, what's happening to the soil, and what can we do differently. And the second, I realized, was agriculture as a big problem, as well as a very vulnerable sector, wasn't being addressed. There were headers in IPCC, land use change, which basically means burn the Amazon to grow GMO soya. Yeah? Or the issue of deforestation, production itself. Each of these is 15 to 20% of the greenhouse gases. Add them up, it's 50%. So I started writing Soil Not Oil to basically talk about two cultures. One, the culture of soil, and the other, the culture of oil. And the culture of oil is really just a pathetic 100 years old. And soil is not just the basis of human civilization, but is the very basis of life on Earth. And the word human is derived from the word humus, which is living soil. So we are the soil. And in 2014 and 2015, the year of soil, the book came out, but more importantly, we basically started to show that economies and technologies centered on oil were a large part of both the climate crisis, but the desertification crisis too. And in that, we actually also, as Navdanya, we wrote an international manifesto. And we called it Terra Viva. Our soils, our commons, our future. Because we were doing this in Italy, and the refugees were coming across the Mediterranean in boats, and the boats were sinking. And I wanted to understand what's the connection between degradation and desertification of soil and the uprooting of people. And there is now a United Nations treaty on land degradation and desertification, and they admit that if we don't start taking care of the soil, and the only way to take care of the soil is through organic farming and agroecology and regeneration of biodiversity, according to them, 70% of humanity will be refugees. So the link between the biodiversity in the soil, the life of the soil, the biodiversity on a planetary scale, this refugee problem is being made to look like enemies entering your land. But they're displaced people. I'll give you a very simple example. In our study, we looked at, again, Nigeria, the northern part, is Lake Chad, which is surrounded by 4 countries. It used to be 22,000 square kilometers before globalization. And then part of globalization is to outsource production to cheaper countries. So they started to prevent the water of the rivers that went to the lake to replenish the lake, to divert it to irrigation of commodity crops for export. 80% of the water stopped entering the lake. The lake started to dry up, and that created conflicts around water scarcity between pastoralists, between farmers, between fishermen. And the way colonization has evolved, by and large in Africa, settled agriculturists became Christians in the Christian wave of colonization, and the pastoralists are Muslims. So these were conflicts created by greed and the destruction of the earth, but they're always presented as conflicts of religion. And this is exactly what I saw in my study on Punjab and the crisis of 1984, which basically forced me to look at agriculture. So we have to return to the soil, and that's why at our Earth University, we call all our courses on agroecology returning to the earth. We've been made to believe that we are outside and masters and conquerors, and the levels of destruction. So a lot of the young people are panicking about climate change, There are actually now policies being introduced to address this panic. But we don't have to panic. We can just turn to the soil and say, sorry, apologize for the age of oil. We're not going to be part of it. We're going to phase out, and not just phase out of the fossil fuel, phase out of the poisons that are based on fossil fuels. And so I'm very happy tomorrow there'll be a workshop exactly on the poison-free farming, which is how we take care of the soil, take care of human health, take care of life on Earth.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My next question is actually, in some ways, you anticipated the answer because you started talking not just about the earth and also the soil, but now what about the cultivators, the farmers? Has your work shifted in any way as a result of climate change, and what are the modes of resistance that might be possible in agricultural context, not just of climate change, but also anti-farmer policies? Are there, what are the strategies that you would recommend in this context?
As I mentioned, I started to look at agriculture after '84, when the Punjab violence erupted and the Bhopal disaster of a leak from a pesticide plant killed thousands. That's the day I wanted to understand where these poisons come from. But I also started to value biodiversity. I started a campaign called No More Bhopals, Let's Plant a Neem, which is a natural pest control agent. And 10 years later, it was patented. And 11 years, I fought that case. And we defeated the USDA and W.R. Grace, the same company that led to the groundwater contamination outside Boston in Massachusetts. And the film called A Civil Action is based on that contamination. And this company now wanted to claim invention of the use of neem for pest control. I just started to save seeds in 87 and created Navdanya in 91. And I work on 2 basic assumptions. That the earth is not stupid, and people are not stupid. And so we said, if there are seeds that our ancestors evolved, we'd better save them. We shouldn't sit and do, there used to be in the 80s, the World Bank had floated a system called willingness to pay. How much will you pay to protect what? And they'd ask people in New York City how much they'd pay to protect what species in the Amazon, and how does a New Yorker know what species are in the Amazon? They wouldn't ask the indigenous people who'd say we don't select. We don't work on the logic of extermination and disposability and dispensability. All of it is a vital web of life. So we saved every seed. In 99, we had a terrible cyclone. The salt water came 3 miles inland in Orissa. But we had saved salt-tolerant seeds, and we could distribute them. And then we started to encourage farmers to grow these out, because a salt-tolerant rice is still rice. It's not salty rice. It just tolerates salt. Yeah? And so we started to promote its distribution, and we could take 2 truckloads of seed to Tamil Nadu after the tsunami in 2004. The big Bay of Bengal tsunami. We have, of course, resisted the patenting, resisted the piracy, and created community seed banks in a decentralized way. So cyclones come where the coast is. In central India, droughts are more frequent in climate change. So we are saving seeds in a decentralized way and working with farmers in participatory selection and breeding to constantly observe how different crops, different varieties do. And the one thing they themselves are understanding and knew traditionally, but it was kind of subjugated with the idea of industrial breeding, is that nature evolves. That you don't have to engineer, you can't engineer a gene of climate resilience because it's too complex. You can steal a climate resilient crop and patent it, but you can't engineer it. Not only is farmers' knowledge evolutionary, but plants are evolving higher capacity to respond to changing climates. Other a big issue, and some of you were at EcoFarm, and I said it there this morning, is so much of the new thinking of industrial agriculture is farming without farmers. Yeah? That the obstacle is the farmer themselves. And they've always had for very long. When I did the work on GATT, I remember a US Secretary of Agriculture having said, we have to squeeze the last farmer off the land like we squeeze toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. And now they're talking about farming without farmers, farming with drones, farming with artificial intelligence. So how do we resist this? My resistance is about creative resistance. Yeah? That you do not cooperate with the destructive system. And we call that satyagraha. That's the power of truth. But you fully throw your weight on a creative alternative of working with the earth, working with community. And as a result of this, what we've been able to do is show in our research that small farms actually produce more. Biodiverse farms produce more. If you intensify biodiversity, you actually create climate resilience. We've done a lot of research to show a biodiverse farm has less failure in a drought because it's holding more organic matter and more moisture in the soil. And monocultures have much more vulnerability in climate change. Our research is showing that if you shift from yield per acre to measuring health and nutrition per acre, which is what food should be about, food systems should not be about the commodity that leaves the farm to run a car, which is what biofuel is. 90% of the corn and soya being grown now is animal feed and biofuel. It's not in the food cycle, it's not in the food system. But even more importantly, we've done economic studies on true cost, and we've assessed the externalities, the damage to the environment, the damage to farmers, as well as how much better off small farmers are in local circular economy. So we've got to intensify biodiversity, we've got to intensify ecological systems, and we have to intensify the ecology of society. deeper, better relationships. And when you were being introduced, this whole issue of basic needs, we are part of the earth. Eating is part of our living. So the right to food is as important for us as for the butterflies and bees. Yeah? And I think we are at this moment where a few connections in knowledge and connections in activism can take on these giants because they're standing on absolute falsehood.
So this is the last question before we open it up to questions in the audience. Yes. Okay.
You'll have to cook up more questions.
Okay, I will. Well, this is actually another question that was shared by some colleagues. Given the present situation worldwide regarding representation and structural inequalities, what strategies and advice would you give to young people and citizens in facing big multinational corporations, nation states, or higher education institutions?
So, I've just written a new book. It's called Oneness versus the 1%. And it's published by New Internationalist in England. And my book was really an attempt to ask myself when, Bayer bought Monsanto, I said, what's going on? Monsanto's a giant. How's Bayer buying Monsanto? And then my son did a lot of the research for this book, and we found out, actually, what has happened in the 25 years since globalization, corporate globalization, is the deregulation has allowed a handful of people to become billionaires. Yeah? It used to be about 300 10 years ago, then it dropped to 100, then it became 80 4 years ago. It was 50. It was 8, and this last year I looked, it was 5 billionaires controlling half the wealth of the world. Now, the top 10 billionaires are either in information technology or in finance. They need to invest their huge amounts of money, right? So after the 2008 Wall Street crash, new investment firms grew. And the two big ones are BlackRock and Vanguard. Now, if you look at corporate ownership, these days, it's not small shareholders who own these companies. The top shares are in the hands of these investment firms, which hold the money of the billionaires. So we are talking of the billionaires controlling the economy. And of course, I see it partly as an addiction, where you don't know when to stop making money. Yeah? It's like a cancer cell. It doesn't know when to stop growing. They are like cancer on the planet. But they also now have so much influence that they literally dictate to governments how governments will run. And you talked about higher education. Part of what's being floated in a very big way, in a very quick way, is the fact that we should move towards a zero liability corporation. So when East India Company, which was the first corporation created, it was called a limited liability corporation. And why was it called limited liability? Because when these ships went earlier for the gold and then for the spices from India, all of the colonizing powers wanted it, right? So they had pirates at sea, and they'd steal each other's ships. So the 300 merchant adventurers who formed the East India Company, who then controlled China, they controlled India, they controlled all of it, that if the ship comes back, then the profits are theirs. But if the ship is stolen by the Dutch East India Company or the French, or the Spanish, then it's society that must pay them. It is a socialization of costs and privatization of profits. And there's new budgeting systems being created called zero budget, which are basically saying, make a budget every year, anything that doesn't pay immediately, cut it out. And they're trying to force this on public budgeting, including education budgeting. That's where the neoliberal philosophy of profits at any cost starts to play in. And I think we need to be aware of two things. One, you can have crazy leaders, right? We can even have crazy people who vote crazy leaders. After all, Hitler came in through elections. Most of our elected leaders have been elected. Yeah? How is it we end up electing leaders of the kind that are there? First, because they're really puppets of big money. And they've been chosen to be the ones, through their being a puppet, performing the roles. Because they carry no social conscience. They don't even carry experience of society. They definitely don't carry experience of democracy. If you look at the framework I have a graph in my book, the wealth concentration at the time of the Great Depression was the concentration in the wealth of the hands of the robber barons. And then we had distribution of wealth. And that's where, a worker in a factory in America could do well. It's come right back to where it was at the time of the Great Depression. That concentration of wealth and the polarization of society. Now, with this electoral machine that is run by money, in your country, the watershed was the Citizen United case, where corporate power to steal elections became freedom of speech. Not only do they put people in place who will do their work, but when they find people are starting to rise, everywhere in the world, at the same time, new divide and rule policies are happening. Exactly in the same pattern. So for young people, the first is defend your constitutions. Participate in deep democracy. Participate in deep democracies in the structures that are there, but deepen the structures. I believe what's happening with the issue of basic needs on this campus is deepening democracy beyond where it was yesterday. I have called this deepening of democracy earth democracy. First, recognizing that we are part of an earth family and other beings have rights. But secondly, also recognizing that we are part of one humanity and we will not be divided by race or religion or class or gender through hate. On this issue, partly because we've been through this before, in the East India Company was thrown out by Indian peasants in 1857. We had an amazing movement, we call it the first movement of freedom. And then the British Crown took over, and they realized if all the people fought together, there would be no place for their rule. So they started to work on a project of divide and rule on the basis of religion. They created census, they created identities, they created all kinds of systems. And it took 40, 50, 60 years for people to start seeing them in this divided identity. And not just a divided identity, but as Samuel Huntington, whose book, The War of Civilizations, Clash of Civilization? Clash of Civilization. He wrote somewhere in there, you can't know who you are till you know who you hate. And I said, this man has no idea of what being alive is. Because you know who you are because of what you love and what you protect through that love. So we now have inverted identities. And if the workers lost their jobs with globalization and neoliberalism, if someone comes to them and says, you know, the reason you don't have a job is there's migrants, they're going to be voting for the party that hates the migrants. And there was an amazing research done on how Facebook sold its data to Cambridge Analytica, which then worked on algorithms of hate on 4 targets: hate of women, hate of blacks, hate of Muslims, and hate of migrants. And that's what has created what we have today. So, an absolute, resolute resistance on division. To deeply believe in our common humanity and our common earth citizenship. And no matter what external input is coming. Because I believe that is the revolution of our times. That oneness.
Thank you very much. In this short time, you've drawn attention to the importance of women, to seeds, to the earth democracy, and you've also talked about collective futures. And so I think that one of the great accomplishments of all your work has been this making what happens in one place something that is important and a global concern. So can you share a little bit more about where do you think we could go next about collective futures? How else can we make the future a brighter and better place?
I think the future needs our consciousness as planetary citizens. I think what went wrong with corporate globalization was it globalized the movement of goods with huge amounts of use of fossil fuels, huge amount of toxics. And it shrunk our consciousness. Yeah? And what we need is an elevation and an enlargement of our consciousness to recognize we are planetary citizens. And while being planetary citizens, we have to reduce our ecological footprint and enlarge our inclusiveness. So in India, it's, some of our cultural practices have been so beautiful. For example, in every home, at least traditionally, we had a tulsi plant. And I noticed the tulsi tea is all over the place now. And there's a very beautiful shloka for the tulsi plant to say, in you resides the universe. I will take care of you. Telling myself daily that if I care for you, I'm caring for the universe. And the word Navdani, I want to share this with you, that I'd started saving seeds. I knew I had to save seeds because we couldn't have seeds patented, we couldn't allow diversity to disappear. We took a pledge that we've received these seeds from our ancestors and nature, and we have to hand them over to future generations in the diversity, integrity, beauty, purity with which we've received it. So we will not practice in any way that contaminates them, and GMOs are contamination of seed. We will not accept any law that turns them into property, Monsanto. And I was just calling it the movement for seed saving, Bij Bachao. Till I went for a seed collection to a part of South India, a forested region, where there used to be a bandit called Veerappan. He made it to Newsweek, Times, he used to have a big mustache, he used to smuggle sandalwood, and was very rich. And he'd off and on kidnap a film star and make it big in the news, but no one dared to go to his region. So I just said to myself, that's where extension officers won't have reached, and the chemicals won't have reached, and the monocultures won't have reached. So I'll go for a seed collection. And people saying, no, you're going to his territory. I said, I'm not a threat to him. What would he do to me? And I entered this area and I'm looking at fields and this beautiful field and I'm counting the plants because in Punjab, I'd studied the monocultures of rice in one season and wheat in the other, and I'm counting. And he was growing, this tribal peasant was growing 9 crops. And I said, wow, you're growing 9 crops. And he looked at me and said, yes, Navdanya. And I said, you say it with such deep meaning. What does it mean? Here I am, PhD, studied high degrees, have no idea what's Navdanya. Huh? And he says, the 9 planets, the 9 crops in my field, the biodiversity in my body is one continuum of harmony. And maintaining that harmony, I do by growing diverse crops in harmony. So that's how small actions are interrelated, because if we realize we are not living in a world of separation, we're living in a world of interconnection, and then if the greenhouse gases of the Industrial Revolution are building up today, if pollution by rich countries is melting the glaciers in the Himalaya, you can flip it and say the right action and the right livelihood done in a remote place can start shifting the balance, can start changing the trends and creating new possibilities.
So we actually have time now to collect the questions. If you had a chance to write on the index cards, please pass them either to this side or to this side, and we'll be collecting them. And then we'll bring them up to the stage, and we have time to ask however many we can get through, right?
If you have one more question while we're gathering.
Oh, sure. One more question. Well, I'm just curious in terms of, this is just on the fly, but I'm curious in terms of, are there particular, you mentioned this incredible place where you saw biodiversity. Are there other parts of the world where you are inspired? Can you share other examples where you find inspiration?
Well, you know, now the Navdanya farm is very inspiring for me. I mean, the fact that I travel and then I go back there and I watch the pollinators. We have 6 times more pollinators in our farm than in the forest next door. And all we did was save seeds. But when you grow 2,000 crops, each of them has different flowers. Each of them invites different pollinators. And by doing the right thing, you trigger a series of webs of interconnection. We did not plan to conserve water, but because we put so much organic matter back, the soil in Navdanya farm and the valley where we work with farmers has 99% more organic matter and 100% more nitrogen than in the chemical farms. No, than in the control, which is the uncultivated land. And it is even more because the chemical farms have lost 14% organic matter and 22% nitrogen, and then all the vital nutrients. But because we've conserved organic matter, the soil is holding more moisture. So we don't have to keep irrigating. And the water that comes with the rain is able to infiltrate better, and our water level has come up 70 feet. So just working with nature, every day there's so much to learn and so much hope that gets cultivated. And I do hope that we will create a strong partnership between Navdanya and the university here, both for you to get as inspired by biodiversity and communities as I do, but also for us to do mutually enhancing research that fills the vital gaps for us to make a complete picture of how much more effective it is to align our work with nature than work at war with nature.
Great. So we have the delivery of perhaps our first batch of questions here. And thank you, everyone, for your incredible attention as well as fantastic questions here. Thank you. So the first question is, you speak about the power of truth. How does one successfully spread messages of truth in an era of, quote, alternative facts, and unquote, as well as, quote, fake news?
Yeah. Never try and compete with fake news. And you don't need to, because it's just a lot of noise. Yeah? What we need to create is basically communities of truth. And as long as we know in those communities what's the right way to farm, what's truly good food, what is deep democracy, then out of this will be the seeds of the future. Because there's no way we can compete with that noise, and we don't need to.
So another question from the audience. The majority of our Earth's problems pertain to excessive human population growth. How can we best address the immediate need of this population issue?
Well, in my book, Earth Democracy, I have a whole section on the issue of population growth. When I talked about the balance that the tribal farmer taught me, about the balance between the cosmos, the balance on our farms and the land, and the balance in our bodies, I said in the beginning, I work on the assumption that people are intelligent. And the data shows that people regulated their populations to stay within the carrying capacity. Not through external coercive measures, but through the intelligence of what are the right numbers. And there's not a culture I know, including the so-called backward tribes, that hasn't had contraceptive practices. They know the plant. Even neem itself has been a very effective contraceptive. The big population growths start with colonialism. In India, the data is very clear. We had a very stable population for centuries. And then the British came, took over the land. 1815 onwards, the graph starts to go like that. Scotland, they have the Highland clearances. After that, the population starts to climb. And basically, when you know this is the part of the earth that you must take care of, and that earth can support, population regulation is built into the ecology of community. But when you're uprooted from your land, you have no certainty. And you're left so dispossessed that the only thing you have is selling your labor. There was a very important population study done on Punjab by Mahmood Mamdani, who now teaches at Columbia. He did it in India, his PhD, and he's talking to this poor landless peasant who has 8 kids or something, and he says, "Why do you have so many children?" And the peasant says, "The landlord can buy his next tractor. I can only have my next child." Not knowing how many will live by the time I'm old, not knowing when the work will come. So increasing numbers becomes a response of a community in precarious conditions. And it is a symptom of exploitation and injustice. Now, there have been again and again and again attempts to control the population. I remember I was in Cairo for the big population conference. And it's unbelievable. The poster of the conference had a pregnant woman as the population bomb. Our wombs are not population bombs. You know? And violent technologies to control the so-called population bomb have never worked. They've caused problems for women. I mean, I know how many cases in India. What works is justice. And in my country, the state of Kerala just decided, they said everyone has a right to land. And the poorest of people, the poorest of women in a hut in a slum, had the right to that land where a hut was. Right to health, right to education. They made all this universal. The population strength started to go like that. Justice, rather than coercion, is the way to go.
So this third question from the audience is, what is your life purpose or mission in life, and when did you discover this? Do you have a story that you can share around this?
My life's purpose is to serve the earth and community. I thought, when I was very young, that my life's purpose was exploring the world. You know, I'd grown up in the forests of the Himalaya, and my inspiration was Einstein. I just wanted to do good physics. And then I saw a forest disappear. And that day, I said, okay, I'll understand nature through studies and physics, but I will defend nature through activism. And that's what I've been doing since the early 70s. I don't do it in a static way. I don't do it, you know, you can't be a good activist unless you are serving. If you bring competition, if you bring ego, if you bring all of that baggage, you wear out, because these are extremely dissipative values. But when you give, there's no limit to giving. You know, when you share, and when you see something. So I began with forest protection, but when I saw Punjab and Bhopal, I said, no, I got to look at agriculture. And when the seed issue came up and patenting of seed, I said, got to protect the seed. And you don't do it in a grasshopper way, you know, hop here, hop there, hop there. You draw the continuity. So I took the continuity of my quantum training, of non-separation, of potential, of uncertainty, of no excluded middle. These are very foundational concepts to undo the patriarchal knowledge of separation, to undo the illusion of immutable essentialness of things. You know, women are inferior, blacks are inferior. All of biological determinism has grown from that false assumption of fixed qualities, when everything is in evolution and everything is in the making. And the more you contribute to the making of the world around you through generosity, the more it gives back. And I think we are at the verge where this illusion of the economy as it was constructed through colonialism, through fossil fuels, through the neoliberalism, it has left so much destroyed and is not working for anyone but those 5 sad millionaires, and their faces are sad. Just look at them, you know. I think creating living economies, shaping and participating in living democracies, to create a democracy is my service for the rest of my life.
So this is coming likely from one of our students in the audience. What advice would you give to a young person seeking to do meaningful work that benefits the world? What sort of work should we seek?
You know, I never give advice. Otherwise, I'd be a guru, Om Shanti. You know. I do my work, and I hope that the inspiration of that work creates the inspiration for you to seek your meaning, and to seek your potential, and to seek your passion. And let that be your guide, and you'll find your right place.
So we have a few more questions here. How can people go beyond conscious consumerism, such as buying and eating organic or local or fair trade, towards taking more concrete action in climate and food justice? And then in parentheses, AKA, what should we do?
Yeah. So this period of neoliberalism, added to the period of colonialism, made us think of ourselves as consumers. Interestingly, the word consumption in the Middle Ages referred to TB. You died of it. Yeah? And if you think of colonialism, what was colonialism? Go grab a country, take its resources, and sell bad commodities. And fool them that the junk that you brought was superior to the wealth that you took. In India, we actually had this stressed as a Macaulay principle. Macaulay was, I don't know, one of the Britishers who was sent to India. And he said, my God, these guys are too rich, they've got too much wealth. There's no way we'll colonize them. But if we can convince them through education that they are inferior and we are superior, and take what they have and sell them the junk, then we'll be rich. And that is where consumerism started. Now, to undo this, our freedom movement had boycotts. So Gandhi said, we're going to make our own cloth. And my inspiration for seed saving came from the spinning wheel. Because in that period, the empire that controlled the world, 80% of the territories were controlled by the British Empire, one little island nation that's now broken off as Brexit. And doesn't know where it's going anymore. Except that Boris Johnson's first speech says we must liberate the GMO. And he must import chlorinated chicken legs from America. Yeah, I mean, that empire is reduced to this. The dump yard of all the junk of the United States agribusiness industry. Yeah. Anyway, so, Gandhi said, if we continue to send our cotton, sell our indigo, and continue to buy textiles, we will never be free. We can keep shouting we'll be free, but we won't be free. To be free, we must make our own cloth. And when he came, no one was spinning because our textile industry had been totally destroyed. He found an old woman of 80 and said, you know how to spin? She said, yeah, we used to spin. Do you have a spinning wheel? She said, yeah, up in the attic. She said, can you bring it down and teach me? He then taught the country. And there's a part in his biography where he's saying, and when people would say, how can a few pieces of wood bring you freedom? He said, it's the only thing that can, because this can be in everyone's hands. And when everyone is spinning, and the last woman is able to make her own cloth, we'll be free. We'll be free by self-making. And the word we have for this in Hindi language is swadeshi, making yourself. if we have to move beyond, first of all, a consumer can never be conscious. Because to become a consumer yourself, you've lost your consciousness of having creative power to make. Yeah? So reclaiming our full creativity and our full humanity and engaging in self-making. We had the reception across there, and there's this beautiful installations of art, as if it's coral, but it's handmade crochet. So I think if we did more self-making in growing food, saving seed, knitting, stitching, repairing things, can you imagine how big the economy we can create? How much more work we can create? And you have a big debate in this country on the Green New Deal. Now, it's inspired by the New Deal at the time of the Dust Bowl and Depression. And the idea was, how do you address the Dust Bowl through soil conservation while creating work to address the Depression? We are in that kind of moment. But I don't think it's enough to say the Green New Deal should be about renewable energy. No, the Green New Deal has to be first and foremost about a new pact with the earth. That we will not treat you as raw material. We will not treat you as inert and dead or a dump yard. We see you as our Mother Earth. We see you as living. We will take instruction from you. And that's where indigenous cultures become very relevant. I mean, just in California, if the indigenous people who take instruction from the earth could be instructors for renewal of the earth in today's moment, can you imagine the world we'll create?
Right, wait, no, sure, I'll take some more, just in case. Yeah, just in case. So, this is an interesting question. Do you see the United Nations as an important but generally undervalued ally and leader?
The United Nations is undervalued. It's being further eroded. It is an essential element of an international system. We wouldn't have a climate treaty without the United Nations. We wouldn't have a biodiversity treaty. We wouldn't have a biosafety protocol. We wouldn't have a human rights agreement. We wouldn't have any of the structures that give some hope for justice and human rights. So it's not good enough and strong enough right now, but that doesn't mean we trash it. We've got to hold it, deepen it, while we deepen democracy at the local level.
So another question has to do with water. Could you please speak on the issue of water, which has been said to be the new oil?
Yeah, everything's becoming the new oil. Big data's the new oil, water's the new oil, biodiversity to be extracted and pirated is the new green oil. I think we need to put the oil paradigm behind us. Yeah? Water will never be oil, water will be water. For those who are thinking of it as the new oil, they're thinking of converting the scarcity that has been created by mining water through industrial agriculture. All the research is there. I have a book called Who Really Feeds the World, in which I have all the data from the UN assessments. And 75% of the water destruction is because of industrial farming. In my country, we had no water crisis when I was growing up. Till the 60s, water was at 10 feet, even in the desert of Rajasthan. And we used to use these wonderful Persian wheels, for irrigation. And then they brought the Green Revolution crops, which needed more water, 10 times more water. Then they brought the deep tube wells. They brought the big dams. Now the rivers are dead and the groundwater is drying. We mined the water to that. In this country, fossil water is being mined. Water that will never be renewed. Aquifers that will never be renewed. So when the scarcity started, those who see money everywhere, started to say, wow, now we can make money out of water. And so when they say the new oil, that's what they're meaning. And interestingly, when you do the kind of work I do, you very often get information anonymously in your mailbox. And I got an amazing document on how Monsanto wanted to privatize water. And it was interesting. It said in the beginning, water's getting scarce, water's getting polluted. Investing in water can be very sustainable business. And that's how they talked of sustainability. Perpetual profits. And then they go on to say, basically when they did genetic engineering, they merged the chemicals and the seed. Roundup-ready crops sells more Roundup. And they said, if we now control water and put chemicals in the water which will be necessary to germinate the crops, that's where the future profits will be. I immediately wrote on this, and they had to shelve that project. But they are, the World Bank, the IMF, and 4 water giants want to privatize the world's water. There was an extremely big privatization initiative by Bechtel of Bolivia's water. And that's what led to the movement, which then actually put Evo Morales in power, and the poor man's just been removed through a coup. It was a water issue. Delhi, Suez is one of the world's biggest water privatizing companies. Again, they put big ads in the newspaper of how they were going to privatize Delhi's water. But they were going to privatize the Ganges River water to sell in Delhi. So I immediately organized a water democracy movement from where the Ganges starts all the way to where the Ganges ends, but also in Delhi. We united the people who'd been displaced by the dam. We united farmers who were going to lose their water. We united the people on the Ganges who, we have cremation, so we bring the ashes to the Ganges. And they're people who know your ancestors for 80 generations before. Because that's how long the ashes have been brought. We united them, and I went to the slums of Delhi and brought the poor, and I went to the rich colonies where people would get water all the time. I said, would you like to get water at the cost of the poor people having no water? Because that's what this commodification was. And this water democracy movement forced a cancellation of that World Bank project and the Suez privatization.
So we have time for perhaps 1 and possibly 2 questions left from the audience. And this one is slightly long. So the author writes, you spoke of ecofeminism and about how men may be ecofeminist and that they may be seeking a way out of violent patriarchy. According to this author, I see in the US the rise of a violent masculine ecofascism tied to white nationalism, at the same time stoking fear of democratic socialism. And the question is, how do you see people coming together across such huge divides?
As I said in an earlier response, not fall into the trap of that divide. And when we build new solidarities between nature and all our species, between indigenous cultures as well as the descendants of the slavery of the colonial times, between women and men seeking a deeper humanity, that alliance of solidarity is what gives us the power of love to resist the power of hate.
And for our final question of the evening from the audience, what is a tangible action we can take in our daily lives to move towards the collective future that you describe? How can we be planetary citizens in our actions?
my searches have taught me that food is where we can begin. Both because food is what connects creation. Food is the currency of life. It's what moves. And when we grow food for all life, because we don't grow food only for ourselves. When we grow food with biodiversity, we're growing food for the pollinators and the butterflies and the bees. When we do organic farming, we are growing food for the soil organisms that are then giving us food in this reciprocity and these circular economies. Food is where dealing with today's empires begin. Because today's empire is an empire over life on earth and control over food, control over seed, control over food. Otherwise, the venture capitalists, the financial giants, the Bill Gates, the Jeff Bezos wouldn't be pouring all, and the Mr. Zuckerberg, we stopped him from trying to take over Indian agriculture. You wouldn't imagine. He also wanted that, besides Facebook. Jeff Bezos right now wants to take over our education programs in school so that Alexa teaches our kids how to eat right. And I've started a campaign saying, we learn from our mothers and grandmothers, not from Alexa. Yeah? So the billionaires have their eyes on our food, on our farms, on our seed. And when I started seed saving, I remember, Kissinger during the Vietnam War had said, food is a weapon. When you control food, you control people. When you control arms, you control governments. And I said, now they want to control the seed, which means you control life on earth. So they are life lords. Earlier we had landlords, now we have life lords. And the life lords really want your plate. They want your gut. And the more sick they make you, the more drugs they sell, because the poison cartel that sells poisons is the same that sells you the pharmaceuticals. They're the same. Yeah? And that's where the merger of Bayer and Monsanto makes it absolutely clear. So no matter what you're looking at climate change, 50% of the problem, industrial agriculture. 100% of the solution, biodiverse, organic, local food systems. Looking at disappearance of biodiversity. The extinction crisis is based on destruction of habitats for more and more large-scale monoculture farms and use of toxics and chemicals that are killing species. Solution, grow diversity, protect species, get the poisons out of your plate, and that's why we have a campaign on poison-free food and farming. And do keep in touch, to build this campaign strong, because my dream is California could become the first state for poison-free food and farming, given the number of institutions like Santa Cruz looking at agroecology, the number of people making a choice to go organic. Once I was addressing one of the campuses, must be 10 years ago, and I just asked the students, I said, how many of you would be farmers and food producers if you could? 80% of the hands went up. And last year I was debating Bayer in Berlin, and this representative is saying, the reason we have to have all of these new technologies, more drones to spray poisons and more surveillance and more driverless tractors is because no one wants to farm. So I just said, why don't we check with the audience? Again, all the young people put up their hand. We are not able to farm because land has gone beyond our reach, farming has gone too costly, and the systems keep us out. So we begin with food, we regenerate health because most chronic diseases are related to bad food. You're a medical anthropologist. You begin with food for healing the planet and people. You begin with food for reclaiming democracy from this dictatorship over life. You begin with food to stop being pathetic consumers of junk, to becoming creative producers and co-creators with the earth of good food.